Thank you, Professor Gaur, and good evening to all the students who assembled.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure to face you and to talk to you in this manner. I will give you my presentation on the Indian nuclear diplomacy and India's own role in it.
Yeah.
And I would also expect questions from you, because I'll be happy if you interact with me and ask questions. So now, when you come, you have already had a month of nuclear diplomacy, diplomacy. So, and you probably understand why nuclear diplomacy. But I'd still like to begin why there is a need for nuclear diplomacy. Then the second point which I would cover is what is nuclear technology and weapons. A third point I'd like to say is this: how India came to nuclear technology. And fourth is how India charted its course in diplomacy in the nuclear realm. Now, nuclear diplomacy is very critical because, today, for instance, you must be all reading newspapers, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine had one very sensitive moment when they set fire to Ukraine's biggest nuclear reactor. Though the reactor itself was not affected, and there was only a storage block which was set to fire. So the reactor was not affected, but it sent scare down everyone in the world, because Ukraine is a place where in 1986 there was the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and then Ukraine was part of the then Soviet Union, and the Chernobyl nuclear disaster then sent radioactive emissions and radiation to large parts of Europe, and people were very scared, and it took a lot of time to come to grips with the after effects of that. So this aspect of nuclear power, like when you have nuclear reactors to produce power, their safety is very important. And this safety dimension actually impacts on not only the country where an accident might happen, but neighboring countries and far-flung countries. And therefore, there's a need to consult and confer with each other about the implications. Hence, there is a need for diplomacy. The most important dimension of nuclear enterprise, for instance, was the bomb. It started in 1940s with the Manhattan Project, and the Americans built the bomb because they felt that the Nazis might build a bomb before them. So there was a massive project, 300 top scientists of the time then. Anyone in top physics was involved in the Manhattan Project in America. And they worked with great speed, and they produced a bomb, both kinds, both on uranium and plutonium. And the bomb was tested in 1945. And then it was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So at that time, the bomb was the ultimate weapon, and no one else had it. So the power of the bomb impacted everyone. The violence, the horrible destruction, the Holocaust in Japan, news went to all over the world, and that was the end of Second World War. But then, and the Soviet Union then was still far from a bomb. But it took them 4 years, and they built a bomb in 1949. They tested the bomb. So, hello, there's some disturbance. Can you mute your phone, please, whoever it is? So,
Put your audio off.
So, so the bomb was the biggest dimension of nuclear technology. And then so in the 50s, for instance, when the Soviet Union and the US both started building the bombs, and they started testing. And those days they used to test in atmosphere. So the effects of the tests were also, they were far and wide. There were a lot of concern, and the power of the bomb was increasing. Initial Hiroshima bomb was just about 10, 15 kilotons of dynamite. But the hydrogen bomb in the 50s could go to megatons.
Meenakshi, please put your audio off. Yeah, please go on. Sorry for the interruption. Yeah, please go on.
So there was concern about it. So by about mid 1950s, there was very eminent people. There was a set of very eminent people: Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, and they all started saying that they should do nuclear disarmament and they should worry about turning the clock back on these nuclear weapons. So pressure started growing, and then came the question of nuclear disarmament and the talks for that. Now, for India at that stage, we had scientists who also had grown during the pre-independence period, very close to the actual research. Like we had Dr. Bhabha, we had say C.V. Raman, we had a number of very high Saha. We had Bose, on whose name is the particle boson called. So these people had actually activated the minds of our youngsters and our scientists of that age. And so they looked up to these things, and nuclear technology was the prime of, at that time, of science and technology. Everyone wanted to get into nuclear technology. That's the reason why when Dr. Bhabha suggested to Pandit Nehru that India should go in this track, he immediately got an instant support, and we started that whole process. That process was to get the entire gamut of nuclear technology. That means from mining of uranium to refining it to making it a nuclear reactor, turning uranium into fuel for nuclear reactor, then waste management, and so that entire process. And we were welcomed at that time, because Pandit Nehru had made it very clear that our interest is in the technology as such. India wants to set up a nuclear enterprise, and we don't want to go for a bomb. But it was, implicit that if you have the technology, like for instance, today Japan has all the nuclear technology. If it wants to go for a bomb, it can go for a bomb. So that was very implicit even then. But Pandit Nehru was very cautious because he stood for peace. So that was the first element of Indian nuclear diplomacy, that we wanted nuclear technology, we wanted cooperation with the big powers, and we wanted to set up nuclear reactors, and Baba wanted to set up this entire process. But it was aimed at power, nuclear power. And those days there were very fancy stories about nuclear power, that just a small element, just a small bucket of uranium can fire the provide electricity for a whole city of 10 million or 5 million. So there was so much of promise contained in nuclear energy. So we went for nuclear energy. Then there is this whole aspect that I'm just turning the pages because then there have been these big milestones in the progress world over on this nuclear enterprise. Now, naturally, this progress is dotted by the development of weapons. So important dates are 1945, when the Americans tested the bomb and used the bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. 1949, when the Russians, the Soviets, also tested the bomb. 1954, when they started making the hydrogen bomb. 1957, when the Sputnik was launched by Russia, by Soviet Union, and the implication of the Sputnik was that the bomb could be delivered. You see, once the bomb was made, the question came of delivery of the bomb. So the original bomb was delivered through a bomber airplane. And later on, once the Sputnik was invented, then they started thinking of missiles on top of which they could have a bomb. And the Americans got worried because the Russians, the Soviet Union, then could build missiles which could reach the US. So then started a missile race. Then came 1961, when the Russians tested a 50 megaton bomb. 50 megaton bomb was something like 2,100 times that of Hiroshima. And its impact was such that, it was felt throughout the world, and it was atmospheric tests. So the radiation and the dust and everything else associated with that spread. At that time, there was a lot of concern. And India was also very much part of the global concern about the impact of nuclear weapons. And Pandit Nehru himself was a great exponent. So US and Soviet Union at that time started thinking about, because of global pressure, of talking to each other and of nuclear disarmament. And then came the important date, 1962, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Russians had placed missiles in Cuba. And when the Americans got to know about it, and Cuba is just next door to the US, so they suddenly realized that the nuclear missiles of Soviet Union were just a few minutes away from the US mainland. So then John Kennedy was the US president, and the Russians and the Americans came very close to a conflict at that time. And the world waited with very tense moments. I was a child and I was in school, and I remember my elders looked up, they were glued to the radio, because that 22nd of October in 1962 was a time when there was a fear that there could be a nuclear war, in the sense that if the Americans attack Soviet Union, then Soviet Union can also attack them. So there'll be a nuclear war. And those days, the Second World War was still just about 20 years ago, or even less than 20. So people still remembered the horrors of the Second World War. Nobody wanted the war. So for 2 days, the world waited with bated breath. And finally, the better sense prevailed, and they withdrew. They withdrew from the confrontation. The Soviets withdrew their ships from Cuba, and Kennedy withdrew his threat. And Soviets then removed their missiles from Cuba. But this Cuban Missile Crisis was the most serious event of the last century, which impelled Soviet Union and the US to look at nuclear disarmament. So immediately after that, in next year, in 1963, they agreed to do a partial test ban treaty, which was a treaty to ban testing in atmosphere, in underwater, and in space. So then you could test, but only you have to go underground, so that though there is there will be no radiation leak. India was foremost in support of that, and we signed it. We were the original signatories of the partial test ban treaty. So after that, the whole 60s was a time when India actively, in its part of its diplomacy, was actively campaigning for nuclear disarmament and for a freeze on building of nuclear weapons, for complete elimination of nuclear weapons, and for stopping their use. And in the United Nations, we had a lot of support. And at the same time, we were also progressing in the nuclear enterprise. Like Dr. Bhabha had set up a training school in BARC in Bombay. And that training school was every year training our engineers and scientists for nuclear technology, every aspect of that. For instance, if you read a book by Dr. Anil Kakotkar, who was the chairman of Atomic Energy Commission during the turn of the century, he describes in his book how they were building up their own expertise and how they were trained, and how India was virtually building from scratch this tremendous ability. And so India was getting support from everyone. And this was India's strategic choice. People say that it was an expensive proposition. Why did India go for that? Because at that time, India was grappling with myriad problems of nation building and development. And people outside looked upon India also in that light. It was seen as a developing country. And a lot of people were very condescending, saying, you don't need to develop these things. You leave it to us. There was this whole sense of we and they, So the developed countries felt that developing countries had no reason to develop these technology. We will supply them. But Dr. Bhabha and his colleagues at that time, they felt that self-reliant way is the best way. So they set up this Bhabha Atomic Research Center, which was, they set up an Atomic Research Center in Trombay, which was after Bhabha's death, known as Bhabha Atomic Research Center. And this was the kernel where all aspects of technology, when you have a reactor, you need metallurgists, you need fuel bundles to be made. So you have to be very good with chemistry. So all aspect of science and technology was taught, and our people, our engineers and scientists, they work together. The result is that today, BARC and another center in IGCAR in Kalpakkam, they produce personnel for nuclear enterprise, who are rare, because most of the northern countries, they do not have people going for nuclear technology. Germany, for instance, which was very high on nuclear technology, for the last 20 years, they have actually turned their back on nuclear technology. They don't want to build nuclear reactors. So gradually, if you don't build nuclear reactors, then young men will not go for, or young people will not go for, their engineering courses in that direction. So in the West, there's a crisis of personnel. While in India, we are, because of farsightedness of our leaders, we have today a training school, and we produce engineers and scientists and experts in all dimensions of nuclear enterprise. So this also adds to our heft in the international field in nuclear diplomacy. Then in this whole process, there was this important institution which was created in the 1950s. That institution was President Eisenhower's creation when the US was under pressure for nuclear disarmament and for ensuring that nuclear technology is not used for weapons. But its positive side was also important. So nuclear reactors should also be built because energy was important. So an institution was set up in Vienna. It was called International Atomic Energy Agency. Its purpose was to promote nuclear power, peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and to ensure that in the process of promotion of peaceful use of nuclear energy, no country can divert the technology or material for weapons purposes, for making a bomb. So the IAEA was set up, and it's the first diplomatic conference, which was held in 1956 in Vienna. Our Dr. Bhabha was the chairman of that conference, and the seat of that IAEA was taken to be Vienna. And we were on the board of governors of the IAEA as a permanent member, which was in view of India's own prowess in this field and India's importance because of India's peaceful orientation and India's overall impact on seeing technology as for benefit for mankind and not for harm to mankind. So we have since been, it's now more than 60 years, We have been a permanent member of the IAEA Board of Governors. And IAEA over the years has actually become a crucial, global hub for nuclear technology. I had the benefit of being the IAEA both as part of its secretariat, and also then government sent me as India's ambassador to IAEA. So I was also India's representative on the Board of Governors. And the IAEA has been through these last 60 years through very trying times at times. It got awarded a Nobel Prize in 2005, and its DG Mohammad Al-Baradei, he was given the Nobel Prize. And in 2015, the IAEA was put in charge of enforcing the nuclear deal with Iran. Now, what was the nuclear deal with Iran? This is another dimension of nuclear diplomacy. This dimension concerns the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Because in the 1960s, when there was pressure for nuclear disarmament, the big powers felt that they cannot do all this in a UN setup. So they said that they will do this in bilateral talks. So US and the Soviet Union started focusing on bilateral nuclear disarmament through their bilateral, negotiations. And China and France and UK, they actually took a back seat, and they said once the US and Soviet Union reduced their weapons to to a drastically low level, these countries can also join. But they were concerned felt by them about other countries getting nuclear weapons. So instead of nuclear disarmament, a nuclear non-proliferation treaty was signed. It was a treaty which was actually signed with, it was originally drafted among US, Soviet Union, and UK. And then it was brought to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva for everyone to sign. India did not sign it. It was another dimension of India's diplomacy. India felt that this treaty was unfair and discriminatory because it perpetuates the nuclear weapons in the hands of 5 nuclear weapon states, which was US, Russia, China, France, and England. So India said this is not acceptable to us. It should be universal and acceptable to everyone. And India felt that even development of nuclear technology by us would be under great surveillance, which we felt was discriminatory because the nuclear weapon states were not under surveillance by the IAEA. So for these reasons, we stood against it, and we faced the censure and the opposition of the world community, because one by one, most of the developing countries actually joined NPT, but India stood out. And but when then this phase of our being outside the NPT was also the very challenging time. There were 4 decades or 3 decades, 68 to 98, when we faced international opprobrium, because they felt that India wants to hide. And Mrs. Gandhi then 1974 did a peaceful nuclear test, which was actually to prove technology, but we didn't want to go for weapons. And the peaceful nuclear test was actually accepted as was an acceptable aspect. It was part of the non-proliferation treaty. The non-proliferation treaty had an Article 5, which actually talked about peaceful nuclear explosions. So when India did it, India was doing what was normal, but they all suspected that you are doing it because you want to build a bomb. And after that, this whole peaceful nuclear explosion was dropped from the global, context. And they then went after us. So then after that, they started putting a clamp on India for transfer of technology. And there was a nuclear suppliers group which was set up, which actually gradually tightened its rules. And by 1978-79, we were told that even enriched uranium for our nuclear reactor in Tarapur would not be available to us. At least it will not be made available to us by the US, because US and India had a contract in 1960s. That's how the Tarapur plant was set up in 1969. So we were suddenly faced with that, and we did not go in for nuclear enrichment, uranium enrichment in a big major way, because we could enrich uranium, but it was only for our, at a pilot scale. And so we had to look for France, and then France started supplying nuclear enriched uranium to us for Tarapur. But the nuclear suppliers group kept tightening its noose. So by the 1990s, we had a big problem about providing enriched uranium for fuel for our reactors. So our people then developed another track, which was called, a reactor made by natural uranium. We had natural uranium in plenty in the beach sands of Kerala. We had, even thorium, and in the Meghalaya and in Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, we had uranium mines. So we started prospecting for uranium, natural uranium, and we started building reactors with natural uranium as fuel and heavy water as the moderator. So this kind of reactor, and it was not anything exceptional. Canada was building it, and initially Canada built nuclear reactors in India, which were heavy water reactors, these are called heavy water reactors. But we mastered that technology, and by the 1980s, we had many plants which were heavy water reactors. And today we have come to such a point that a 700 megawatt heavy water reactor has been put online, and we have many which are in the process. So in the next few years, we'll have about 10 plants like that. So this was a kind of a process which is going on, where we were determined to develop technology. We were determined to have expertise which was, indigenous and self-reliant. And at the same time, we stood for nuclear disarmament. So we didn't weaponize our technology. So the 74 explosion was just a technology demonstrator. But until the late 1980s, we didn't go for the bomb. Then came Afghanistan war, and the Pakistanis are very close to Americans because they were fighting. So, and they quietly got the bomb technology from China, and they developed the bomb. In the early 80s, Pakistan had the enriched uranium, and they had the bomb, but they were hiding it. So, and India was aware of this. So we had, excuse me, I'll just take this call. Just a minute. Yeah, I'm giving a talk at the moment. So बाद में करूँगा बात. Hello. So Pakistan had the bomb, and even then, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi felt that the best way is to go for nuclear disarmament. So in the late 80s, we actually proposed an action plan for elimination of nuclear weapons, and a systematic action plan where we also offered to join the whole process at an appropriate stage. But the big powers, they were condescending, and they didn't pay attention to what India was suggesting, and they ignored that. Then came the end of Cold War, and the triumphalism of the winners of the Cold War, which means US and its allies. So in the 1990s, they started rewarding those who had been their partners in the Cold War. So China was treated with great gusto. Pakistani, their deviations, their mistakes, and their hiding and their clandestine development of weapons and missiles was ignored. And we, on the other hand, were treated, very strictly. And 1992, the nuclear suppliers group made a very strict rule, whereby even France was told that you cannot supply enriched uranium to India. So we were facing these problems, and came 1995, where the NPT, with its iniquitous nature, was perpetuated. Originally, the treaty was meant only for 25 years, but then in 1995, it was indefinitely extended. which meant that India will be forever, if India did not act, it would be forever treated, in a second-class category in the global forum. So that impelled us to demonstrate that we will do what is in our best interest. And that led to our test in 1998. And that test opened the eyes of, big powers. Bill Clinton, who's the US president, he himself suddenly realized that apparently something was wrong in their approach to India. And he started to mend fences. And so by 2000, relations between India and the US took a positive turn. And when Clinton came to India in 2000, it was a watershed. India-US relations then started looking up, and they understood. We had a long talk. Our then foreign minister, Mr. Jaswant Singh, had a long session of talks with the US Deputy Secretary of State Talbot. It was stretched over for a year and a half, and where Indian security concerns were explained in detail. And it was explained how India was entering the nuclear club, but reluctantly, because we were forced by our security environment. And the US understood it over the years. So that led to eventually the nuclear deal in 2008, where India and US agreed to do nuclear cooperation. And US dropped the clauses which the nuclear suppliers group had forced on us. They didn't insist that India have full scope safeguards. And they began to supply, and they opened the gates for India getting nuclear technology. So as a result, we had been working now with France and US and Japan for developing nuclear cooperation. And, and with Russia, we had very close cooperation. We have already in Kudankulam 2 nuclear power reactors, which are set up by Russia, under 1,000 megawatt, and there are 4 more online. So, and we have no problem of enriched uranium because we have developed sufficient inventory, and the countries like Kazakhstan and the countries in Africa which have uranium, they are willing to supply us. So we are now in the nuclear technology field at a good stage where we can develop our own nuclear power profile, and our strategic dimension has been kept aloof. So we have put our facilities, civilian facilities, on the safeguards in the IAEA, but our strategic facilities are outside the safeguard, and we have no restraint on that, in the sense that our restraints are our own, but nobody can compel us on our strategic nuclear preparedness. So we are developing what we call the nuclear triad, which means our weapons can be delivered by bombers, by the air, by land-based missiles, and by the sea-based missiles, as well as submarine-based missiles. And we have been testing the missiles like Agni and Prithvi, and we've also been testing cruise missiles. We have the BrahMos, and we have developed long-range missiles. The Agni 5 is an ICBM, and we have also the nuclear submarine Arihanta, on which we can place our weapons. But we have throughout maintained that our nuclear weapons are for self-defense. We are committed to no first use. We will not be the first to use nuclear weapons, and we will not use them against non-nuclear weapon states. And this has been our doctrine from the beginning in 1998 itself, when Prime Minister Vajpayee declared that we are a nuclear weapon state. However, we will not be the first to use nuclear weapons, and we'll abide by the ban on use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. And we also emphasize in our doctrine that we still feel that for our security, the best guarantee is to go for elimination of nuclear weapons. And we want to work for global negotiations to reach a nuclear weapon-free world in a verifiable manner. So these are elements of our doctrine. These elements actually strengthen our democracy, our diplomacy. And now big powers all recognize this, like US, UK, France, Russia, Japan, Canada, Australia, all those countries who actually had some doubts about India's intentions. Now they realize that India is a responsible power, and they are willing to do nuclear cooperation with us. Russia, of course, has been from the very beginning supportive of us, and we had a 1988 nuclear cooperation agreement with Russia, under which they kept supplying us nuclear reactors. So today, the nuclear diplomacy is now at a stage where we are active in the global forums, like in the IAEA, we are active. And as I mentioned, when the Iranian nuclear program was being discussed and negotiated, and finally the nuclear deal was signed between Iran, US, Germany, France, UK, China, and Russia, then its implementation was placed in the hands of the IAEA. So IAEA has been observing safeguards on Iranian facilities and reporting every year, every quarter, how the implementation by Iran has progressed. Recently, Iran is now has been and again in negotiations, because President Trump, when he came to US to White House, he revoked the nuclear deal and revoked the lifting of sanctions, which was the essential part of the nuclear deal with Iran, and that was a setback. But when Biden came back last year, in 2020, then he promised that he will bring the nuclear deal back. So for the last 1 year, they have been negotiating this deal, and chances are up and down. Iran has a certain priority. They want sanctions to be removed first before they can give commitment about not enriching uranium. Iran has capability to enrich uranium, which they had agreed to put aside in the 2015 deal. But today, Iran is still working on nuclear enrichment, and they've said that we will continue to work unless the sanctions are lifted and unless the US conforms to the 2015 deal. So that's how the negotiations have been underway, and all the 6 powers were involved. Despite the problem in Ukraine, and despite the sudden dive of relation, which has taken the relationship between US and Russia to to the worst stage since the Cold War. But still, Russia is part of the 6-nation group, which is negotiating with Iran, and those negotiations are still, they are promising. They are not. There is a certain sense of disquiet, and people say that maybe Iran may not agree or Russia may not agree. But these are the ups and downs in the process of negotiations, and there is still hope that they will all come around and the deal might be signed to bring Iran back to the fold and remove sanctions. So for India, this is really important, because India has important trade with Iran, and we buy oil from Iran. And because of the sanctions on Iran, our oil import from Iran was affected. And we do not want this, because our relationship with Iran are traditional, historic. Hundreds of years we have been neighbors. So and Iran is very important for us. So we would like that relationship to flourish. And that's another dimension of our nuclear diplomacy, that we insist on safeguards. We insist on observation of the international agreements, but at the same time, we do not believe in sanctions unless they are imposed by the United Nations. That means unless everyone agrees. So these are some of the. I have taken, a very rapid survey of these positions because of the crunch of time, and I have already taken 45 minutes. But I'd be happy to answer questions, because as things stand today, there's much more to it. And I'd like to end by saying that the whole process of nuclear disarmament, which had begun after after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and through U.S.-Soviet bilateral negotiations, they had SALT I and SALT II agreements in 1970s. They had START agreements in 2000. Then they had another new START agreement in 2010, and they had the INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, in 1987. All these were cooperation agreements to control nuclear weapons, so that between US and the then Soviet Union, and subsequently between US and Russia, there is stability of nuclear deterrence, and the threat of nuclear war was considered reduced. But over the last few years, this has been under great stress, because Trump actually revoked the INF Treaty. So the Russians also revoked the INF Treaty. INF Treaty was the treaty which removed the entire category of missiles, medium-range missiles, which can be used to develop or to drop nuclear weapons. So that is now gone. So Russia is developing now tactical nuclear weapons, and they have been testing medium-range missiles. And in the latest conflict between in Ukraine, there have been threats issued from Moscow that they are a nuclear weapon state, that they have a nuclear deterrent, and if outside powers intervene, there could be a third world war. It could be a nuclear war. Things of that sort. So these are very threatening kind of noises which are coming, which we had not heard, for the last several decades. So there is a need for today for international community to focus on the negotiations, and there's a need for bringing Russia back to negotiations. What they are doing with Ukraine is still very it's a roller coaster. There's not much happening there, but there is a need for a much larger negotiation. So let us see what happens. At the moment, we are crossing our fingers. The world is actually not at a very good state given the crisis in Ukraine. So with that, I'll end and be open to questions.
Thank you very much, sir. And I think you have covered every aspect of India's nuclear diplomacy, its history, its evolution, and the present status. Now I ask the students to go ahead with their questions. First, introduce yourself, and then you put your question briefly. Yes, come on.
Good evening, sir. My name is Pranjal, and I'm doing a master's in IR from Jawaharlal Nehru University. So my question is, recently the P5 members have issued a joint statement which reaffirms the importance of addressing nuclear threats with the ultimate goal of a world without nuclear weapons. So, sir, what can be the implications of such statements? Whether these are just the mere statement, or these can have long-term effects on nuclear disarmament in particular?
Oh, well, that statement, when it was issued, it was earlier this year, and it was welcomed by everyone. India also welcomed it because it was actually a very positive development, since it came after the previous, preceding years, when US and Moscow they went out of the INF Treaty, and there are many other agreements of the Cold War era which were signed by the US, Open Skies Treaty, and so US and Russia were on a entirely different wavelength. So this fact that and this statement which was issued, it had the prime sentence, which was, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. This was issued by Reagan and Gorbachev in 1985. And that started the whole process of nuclear disarmament between the two, and set the tone for INF Treaty. The fact that all the 5 nuclear weapon states came back to this was taken with a sigh of relief by everyone. And however, after the Ukraine invasion, this statement has been now again under the cloud because because of the kind of uh, threatening noises made by Moscow.
Okay, thank you so much, sir.
Yes, next question. Come on, be quick.
Good evening, sir. This is Akhilesh Trivedi, a doctoral student from Kanpur University. So I have a question like, do nuclear weapons have the potential to deter non-state actors? And is it possible to avoid further nuclear proliferation if present nuclear powers continues to use nuclear weapons as a deterrent?
Well, you have two questions. Deterring the non-state actors is a requirement of internal security for states who are facing that threat, and you require not nuclear weapons to deter them, but very strong intelligence setup, very strong security within the country, and alertness, vigilance, and a whole set of things which come under nuclear security. In the nuclear security, there were these three summits organized by President Obama when he was the president in 2016, 2014, and 2012, where he emphasized that it's important to prevent unauthorized access and malevolent access to nuclear technology, nuclear material, nuclear fuel, to rule out terrorists getting the bomb. So that's a concern which is being addressed by all the countries of the world, and that's the dimension from terrorism where nuclear issues figure. But other than that, to deal with terrorism, you have to strengthen your domestic intelligence. And like in the US, for instance, after 9/11, they set up Homeland Security, in Homeland Department, and they have been very cautious. So since then, incidents in the US of a serious nature have been reduced. Same has been with India. India has been also addressing these things with great focus. So, and other countries too have focused on, on terrorism. So that's the way, but nuclear deterrent cannot prevent them because that deals with a different dimension. The second thing is, so long as nuclear weapons remain, those who do not have it will have the urge to get them. This is, very logical. It's a very natural kind of a law. And like when Ukraine, for instance, it abandoned its nuclear weapons in 1994 after it broke up from Soviet Union, and when Soviet Union was, dismantled. So today they will be having a, great remorse and repentance. Why did we agree to do that? If they had nuclear weapons, probably Russia wouldn't have been so, unrestrained. And same way, other countries like Japan and South Korea, they also feel the same way. There are people within them, though their governments are steadfast against nuclear weapons, but there are factors within their polity who impel them to think about a nuclear option. And Iran also, though it says from consistently that it is not for nuclear weapons, but after the example of North Korea, where North Koreans have a bomb and they keep threatening US and everyone, and nobody does anything to them. So there is the lesson from there that for countries like Iran and others, that we should also get a nuclear deterrent. So this is the problem, which the only solution of that is elimination of these weapons and reducing their salient. And there are a whole set of measures which have been proposed over the years. And if you combine all of them, much of them are part of India's own policy. If you combine them all, we will move towards a world which will be free from nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much, sir. Akriti, you go ahead with your question. Akriti, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Just a minute. Just a minute.
Go ahead with your question.
Yes, sir. Can I ask meanwhile?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You put
good
your
evening,
question.
sir. Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Thank you for such insightful session. I just wanted to know what do you think about like after attack on Ukraine, like Taiwan has become the another country which is preparing its military arsenal to be prepared to cover itself from China. So how do you think it will be able to do that?
This is a question which is on the minds of people in, in the Indo-Pacific, that one of the negative consequences of the Russian action on Ukraine and the inability of NATO to effectively block it, can that encourage China to move towards, getting Taiwan back into its fold? However, you should see these things in the larger context. The kind of unity which the West has displayed in the wake of Russian invasion of Ukraine, the kind of sanctions which have been placed on Russia, and the commitment which has been shown by NATO and President Biden and the European leaders. There's certain cohesion within NATO. There was a certain disparity which was happening earlier, and Trump was one who is to deride NATO. But Russia's actions have actually consolidated NATO and consolidated the Western powers. So they are united in giving a clear message to Russia that they have made a mistake, they have made a blunder, they will suffer for it, they will pay for it. And a corollary of that will also go to China, that China should not think about any drastic action on Taiwan, because Western states and the US particularly has been committed to Taiwan's independence. They consider Taiwan as part of China, one China policy, but China should not use force to unite Taiwan. That has been the American position.
Yes. Next question.
Good evening, sir. I am Akriti Verma, and I am a final year student of Masters in International Relations. So, I first of all thank you for such an insightful session. So, I would just like to know your views on the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
The Joint Comprehensive Program of Action was a very, very important milestone when it was signed in 2015. And it had a very comprehensive approach to dealing with Iran's nuclear program. It actually removed the possibility of Iran going in for nuclear weapons for a long time. And the enforcement mechanism under that was also very comprehensive. It went further than what the NPT had under its fold, or what the NPT additional protocol had done, because Iran accepted much more intrusive inspections and requirement of monitoring and information sharing with the IAEA. And the IAEA reports after that, between 2016 and 2017, indicated Iran's total compliance. So it was a very successful cooperation agreement. This was done without any use of force. It was negotiated, and the Iranian government agreed with that. So in the field, in the realm of nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation, the Iranian deal, this JCPOA, is a most significant development. Its revocation by Trump was the tragedy, and people the world over criticized it. That President Biden has agreed to reinstitute it has been a positive dimension. And these talks which are underway at the moment, we hope that they will restore the deal. So it's a very, it remains the, extraordinary success story.
Thank you, sir.
Next question.
Hello, sir. Good evening. This is Diya Kuppar. I'm studying BA in International Relations. So my question is, what is your take on a no first use policy?
No first use policy is the only reasonable and sensible stand, because if you think about using nuclear weapons, then you are not alone. And this has been the situation since 1949, when the Russians also developed the nuclear bomb. So there were two powers with nuclear bomb. Then there were three, then there were four, then there were five. And today there are 9 countries who have nuclear weapons. So the best way of stability and peace is that they all agree not to use nuclear weapons first. If they all agree, then at least use of nuclear weapons will be then last resort. It'll be, it'll not be upfront. For countries like India, for instance, who do not believe in that nuclear weapons have any worthwhile use, we have been driven to develop nuclear weapons because of our security environment as a deterrent, and we retain this as a deterrent. So if you retain your weapons as a deterrent, then the logical corollary is that you should have no first use, because you don't want to use these weapons first. In terms of preparations for using nuclear weapons also, in terms of developing your triad and your strategic weapon system, a no first use policy gives you more options. You can develop these things without any anxiety about you're trying to use it. Because when you have to have a first use policy, you have to devise the whole set of steps you will have to put in place to have first use. Now, by devising a no first use, you're giving your adversary that uncomfortable situation, that he has to think about all those steps and retaliation. And despite the thousands of nuclear weapons which US and Russia have, none of them has any guarantee about that there'll not be retaliation. So a retaliation is still in the nuclear age is a foregone conclusion. When that will happen, one doesn't know. So why should anyone think about using nuclear weapons when retaliation is guaranteed? Given that kind of a situation, no first use appears more reasonable and logical.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yes. Next question.
So I had a question. Sir, I would just like to.
Let others have also.
Sir, just a single question.
Okay. Go on.
So I would just like to know that how IAE is role will be enhanced or after this deal.
Oh well, the nuclear deal already put in place these extensive safeguards which IAEA was enforcing, and IAEA was in the center of things. So and it has developed a great deal of experience, expertise, and its methods to go about it. This verification of non-diversion is a very intricate process. You have to not only do inspections of the facilities, but you have to also get information about possible clandestine facilities which might be coming up. And then if you get any information, then you have to question the country which has accepted these safeguards. So that process is also a diplomatic process, and you have to cajole and persuade the country to come out with clarity. And then there is IAEA Board of Governors, where 35 members actually discuss these things, and they take stock of the safeguards report of the IAEA. And this board meets virtually, about 4 times, 5 times a year. So it's a continuous process. Their record so far in ensuring that non-diversion is much better than what it was when Iraq was found in 1990 to have diverted clandestinely, uh, technology for weapons purposes. So today, IAEA stands it is in great credibility. It commands respect, and if the deal comes through again, it'll add to IAEA's importance.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Next question. In that case, sir, as a student, I ask you a question, and it relates to your tenure as a Secretary General of SARC. Was this issue of nuclear energy, nuclear disarmament, bomb, all this, was ever brought before SARC forum? And what was the, opinion of different neighbors?
No, Professor. It was a totally different end of the spectrum that I came to SARC, from nuclear disarmament to SARC. SARC, because of the very difficult political environment under which it was born, all political issues were kept out of the ambit of SARC. Its charter actually focuses only on socio-economic issues and for the well-being of the people of South Asia. So then gradually it focused on trade and trade in goods and trade in services. Then cooperation in all these fields like agriculture, science and technology, energy, electricity. They were building electricity grids now among SARC countries. Then finance also. They were finance ministers meeting. There was transport because they wanted to do free movement of goods between among SARC countries. So there is this great protocol which is now actually moving forward between India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan, BBIN, which is actually for transport corridors. So it is these things. Basically, the economy of what was prevalent before the British left in the subcontinent, that was united economy. But the subsequent developments had actually cut asunder that unity. So SARC process was to, by mutual agreement, by talks and by governmental consensus, restore the economy to that unity. So make a SARC common market. That was the ambitious goal. And trade should be free, people's movement should be free, that kind of process. But nuclear disarmament or political issues were out of its purview. So we never discussed it.
Did Pakistan ever tried to bring on that issue?
Nobody tried. If anyone tried, it was ruled out because it was not allowed by the charter. The SARC charter clearly rules out that. And yes. SARC works on consensus. So even one country, if it objects, then an issue cannot be discussed. But this consensus and the charter was actually necessary to inspire confidence among the members of SARC when it was set up. That look, come and join. Don't carry your misgivings and misapprehensions through this process. See how much you can achieve. And when I was SG, we were at a good phase. We managed to do a lot. We used to have something like 20 meetings in a year of ministers. And we had, at least those days, annual summits. In 2007, 2008, 2010, we had summits. So these summits brought all these leaders together. And they had a retreat where they could talk freely without, aids. And they can, get to know each other. So there was a certain comfort level which was being built in the SARC process. But all that today is broken because of the problems between India and Pakistan. However, if things improve, then SAARC can be, brought back. So I am one of the, incorrigible optimists who feels that this South Asia has so much of potential. It can flourish when they work together rather than when they work at cross purposes. So SAARC is a way out. They are trying BIMSTEC also, which is also a kind of offshoot of SAARC. And BIMSTEC seems to be progressing somewhat. It's a very difficult process, and at the moment, regionalism is also taking a back seat the world over. So let's see how it evolves.
Let us hope for the best, and that is all we can do. Sir, thank you once again for very.
I want to end with a quotation saying, diplomacy gives you hope. It doesn't give you salvation.
No, that's the true nature of diplomacy. And thank you very much for a very exhaustive and authoritative, exposition of India's nuclear diplomacy right from the beginning to the present day time, and what milestones were covered and how India got through the initial hiccups and how India faced pressures from big powers, nuclear powers, and all that. And we hope that we will continue to lead this path. So thank you very much once again on behalf of FPRC and Foreign Policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And with your permission, I close this session. Thank you very much.